Hey guys, we're up. Hey, good. Hey, welcome to. I'm gonna do some short streams here. Today, the topic I wanted to get into is one of the things I think is the most misunderstood concepts in the red pill, as it is today, is vulnerability. And the reason I'm talking about vulnerability today is because I think it gets sort of I think it gets sort of corrupted here. I think a lot of people want to find some reason that vulnerability ought to be some form of game, or else it's if you're not vulnerable as a guy, it means you're like emotionally stunted. Originally, I came up with the idea of covering vulnerability as a result of a few Scott Galloway videos that I have seen recently, and I wanted to sort of give you a side by side comparison of how sort of modern gynocentric society, culture, whatever it is, views vulnerability in men, and sort of the background and the history as to why we can't come to what we think is vulnerability right now. What we think of as vulnerability is what's called transvaluation. And this is a term that I picked up from Jack Donovan a long time ago. Transvaluation is the idea that, strength is weakness, and whatever is the sort of the opposite of something is the positive opposite of it, right? So strength is weakness. Fear is bravery. Facing your fear is bravery, that kind of stuff. So we have this sort of emotionalist language that sort of pervades our conversation in a gynocentric social order. So without further ado, I'm going to show you, let's see, a couple of things here. This was the most recent one from Scott Galloway, and I think this sort of sums up the modern wokesy postmodernist view towards why men ought to or ought not to be vulnerable. So let's have a look
See
here.
what happened with Caleb Williams, the quarterback for USC? No. The guy breaks down and begins sobbing and immediately runs over to the stands and jumps up and embraces his mother. And his mother puts this notebook over his helmet so that the crowd can't see him crying. And his father comes over and consoles him. And I thought, oh my God, this kid doesn't even realize he has moved masculinity so far forward. And the ability to give into that sort of emotion and do it publicly, men never learn how to express they are struggling. And because they're taught from a very early age that real men don't express that sort of upset. I mean, it sends such a good signal to young men that it's okay to be emotional. It's okay to be disappointed. I also think that's such a gift. You want two things. You want your kids to be happy and successful, but you also want to comfort them. Like any chance you would get as a parent to comfort your child, that is key to getting out of a really, really dark place. It's such a moving moment.
So once again here, you see this kid from USC. He's having an emotional moment with his mom. Of course, mom puts the puts the notes up in front of his face and everything. And I think what's interesting is that when we see open displays of emotion, that doesn't necessarily mean that is vulnerability per se. One of the more pervasive messages that an emotional language has sort of taught us, or wants to teach us anyways, is that it's okay to wear your emotions on your sleeve. The problem I have with this is that this is directly related to what's called social constructionism, that everything that we all of our personalities, all of the things that we sort of default to as human beings are culturally created. And that's you'll even hear him say this, and I've heard other people say this as well, is that that young men are taught this. They're taught to be this way. They're taught to be that way. They're taught to repress their emotions. It's like, no, they're not. If anything, they're taught even more so today than ever before to be in touch with their feminine side, be in touch with express their emotions. And I think what's funny is it's only approved emotions. It's only the emotions that a female directed, a society by females for females approves of. So quite honestly, the default emotion for most men is anger, because that's just the way we are wired. We get angry at things. For women, it's to cry. And as I said on the Dr. Phil show back in November of 2022, the idea that that men are in any way being taught to be to be more, repressive of their emotions, or to be invulnerable, I guess maybe that's a better word for it. I mean, the dictionary definition of vulnerability is weakness, and to say that weakness is strength is really a misnomer today. And again, it comes back to the emotional language versus empirical language. So one of the things I really get a bit frustrated with is what I call it's the Titanic dynamic. Okay. At the end of Titanic, we're supposed to, everybody's supposed to cry because, Jack goes to his watery grave, and and then at the end of the movie, she drops the heart of the ocean down to Jack. She's basically this alpha widow for 100 years, right? And she just can't get over the fact that this guy, went to the bottom of her true love, the one that got away, actually has slipped away down to the bottom of the ocean, right? And that we're supposed to have some sort of real sort of emotional moment at that. And when guys don't cry at stuff like that, the presumption is that men are like emotionally stunted, and they can't, they're not in touch with their emotions, so they don't feel the realness of the story. And if they're not shedding a tear, if they're not getting choked up, then there must be something wrong with them. And the fact of the matter is, there's absolutely nothing wrong with them, because men do not process emotion in the same way that women do. But we live in a society that says men have to express their emotions. Men have to get in touch with their feminine side. Men have to be masculine. To be conventionally masculine is to be more like a woman, is to emote like a woman, is to experience life like a woman. And I don't think enough people really can draw attention to this, or drawing attention to it at all these days, simply because it's not popular to say these things, right? To say that emotion is not necessarily a good thing. Sometimes it's better to think with your fucking head than it is to actually, think, oh, I'm going to think with my heart. It'll, follow your heart, girl. It'll never steer you wrong. And like, no, it will steer you wrong. You're making emotional decisions. You're making impulse decisions that could probably impact the rest of your life. Are we going to tell men that that's what they should do? Well, the thing is that men have a burden of performance. And if they follow their emotions and their emotions lead them astray, guess what? They're on the hook for that. They're responsible for that. Men simply don't process emotions in the same way that women do. They don't, and especially negative emotions. Men's negative emotional default is anger. That's an emotion. If I express anger and frustration to the point where I'm like almost ready to throw down, I'm expressing my emotions. I'm just not expressing the emotions that are approved by a gynocentric social order. So the fact that, like, say the quarterback from USC there is crying, he's with his mom. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with crying when your dog dies. There's nothing wrong with crying when your dad dies, or having those emotions. Like, there are stages at a man's life where emotionality, you're overcome with emotion, right? Maybe you won the Super Bowl. I don't know, but the thing is the idea is that a certain class of emotions are better or more publicly acceptable than others. So when I see stuff like this, it really just says to me that this is a man, Scott Galloway, who is promoting the idea that other men should define masculinity through feminine terms. I've said this on a couple of occasions as well, like even on Dr. Phil, when I was saying that, what was it, that we don't celebrate masculinity publicly or in a public sphere unless that masculinity looks like femininity. So when we look at, say, The Rock, and he's this gigantic bodybuilder with bald head, and he used to be a professional wrestler, right? I mean, we look at him and we see where we expect a masculine man. But when you put The Rock in a tutu and he's doing the Tooth Fairy movie, and we laugh at that, well, we laugh at it because it's incongruent with what we think of as conventional masculinity. That's why it's humorous. So what we're essentially saying is we want men to dress up in tutus. We're only going to celebrate it when men start to look more and more like women, rather than actually celebrating a man for being a freaking man, for a guy who is actually doing something that is conventionally masculine. In fact, I've said this in my religion book, where the most churches today don't offer anything to men because they're actively, openly hostile to anything that is conventionally masculine. Now, people lost their minds when I first published that book back in 2021, But now I think people are starting to come around and understand what I was saying, because they can see it in a societal sense rather than a religious sense today. So I've got one more. I got a couple more. Actually, I got a couple more here. Let's start with this one right here.
Kind of school shootings done by girls. Girls have every bit the access to guns that boys do. Girls have every bit the mental health challenges. Why is the mainstream media in the United States, in particular, so reluctant to say out loud that this is fundamentally about masculinity and boys and men's understanding of themselves as gendered beings, as men, as young men? It's rare to see anything close to an honest discussion about the fact that boys and men are doing it and then asking questions about why. But a lot of men are filled with anxiety about talking about this, about introspection, about thinking about their own attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, the ways that many of us who in a million years wouldn't, commit some kind of mass shooting. But nonetheless, we participate in a culture that helps to glorify and valorize violent masculinity. The narratives about American manhood, especially in this case, white American manhood, but not exclusively, are deeply woven into the fabric of sort of American identity.
Okay, so to reiterate and maybe belabor this point again, when I've had this conversation, actually on several occasions, but the one that I'm recalling right now was when I think it was a Florida school shooting. It was Nicholas Cruz, and I want to say it was back in 2018. And myself and my co-host Pat Campbell at the time, we dug into this a little bit, and this same narrative was being applied then as it is right now. So anytime there's an act of violence, anytime there is an act of criminality, anytime a young man commits suicide, anytime a young man is involved in drugs, anytime the guy goes, a kid, right? A teenage boy, maybe it doesn't have to necessarily be teenage. It could be like 18, 19 too. Anytime there is problems with that boy, what's the first thing we say? We say, where's the father? Why do we do that? If we live in an egalitarian, equalist society, then that should never jump to anyone's mind as the default setting. We say, well, where's the men? Where's the people? Where's the guys who are teaching these guys? The problem with that concept is that they are being taught. They're being, in fact, the idea that we're teaching gun violence, or we're teaching violent behavior, or boys need to have in some way to have some sort of instruction on how to be angry, how to be frustrated, how to lash out violently. To be a man is to embrace those things. Men are more violent than women. Simple as that. What are we going to do about it? It's not about teaching them to be that. If anything, for the last, really since the 1970s, we've taught or tried to teach men to be more in touch with their emotions, as I was saying, as Scott Galloway would like us all to believe, right? To get in touch with our feminine side, to be more, a kinder and gentler masculinity. Well, the problem is it's not about the teaching. The boys that this guy, I don't know who this man is, I'm sorry to say, but the problem that I have with this messaging is that we haven't taught those things. There's, with tough drill sergeants or tough coaches to kick, boys don't cry, kick them in the ass, that kind of stuff, or have that kind of conventional masculinity. None of that is really hasn't been in vogue really since the mid 80s. But even if it were, the problem is that men are simply naturally evolutionarily predisposed to violence. They're predisposed to anger. They're predisposed to getting shit done instead of crying about it, instead of complaining about it. Men aren't allowed to complain. So what happens when you teach that child, or that boy, in this case, I was going to say Nicholas Cruz, but when you teach that boy to express his emotions, and his first default setting for expressing emotions is anger, violence, is frustration, is lashing out, when you say, express yourself, Nicholas, and he expresses himself with, an assault rifle, he's just following what everybody has told him since the time he was probably 5 years old, and has absorbed it as a boy. What we're not teaching them is to be resilient. We're not teaching them conventionally masculine things like how to come back from defeat, how to overcome failure, how to deal with frustration. No, instead we're taught, be vulnerable, cry it out, express your feelings, go to therapy. Therapy is going to help you with everything. But the problem is it's female therapy. The idea that men and women are interchangeable and are blank slates and are the result of a social gender is just a social construct, right? So if your personality and who you are and what's expected of you, your burden of performance is rooted in female experience, this is what you get. So it's not about a masculinity that is lacking. It's not even about an abusive, hazing, bully style, tough drill sergeant, tough coach type of masculinity. It's the fact that men today are young men anyways, are self-loathing about their masculinity, or if they understand it at all, because they're taught that it's bad. They're taught that it's dangerous. In fact, this guy right here is just simply saying, to be masculine is to be dangerous. You're a danger to society. So what do? We geld a generation after generation, and we basically say, look, testosterone is the most dangerous compound on planet Earth. And when we do stuff like that, we end up becoming a much more feminized society. So when people say, "Oh yeah, we're in such a female," there's not enough real men these days. You'll hear women crying about it today. Where are the real men? Well, you change them. The real men have been gelded. The real men have been turned into vulnerable, whiny simps. So when we look at this thing, you're only complaining about a society of boys that are confused and conflicted. On one hand, they're told to man up, but on another hand, they're told to man down. Let's move on to where did it go? How about this one?
The decision you'll make is who you decide to partner with, specifically have kids, because you're in that person's life for 20 years. And I have a lot of friends who are successful in most exterior metrics, but don't have a real partner in their spouse. And they have what I would call a life full of stress and disappointment on a regular basis. Whereas I have friends who on an external basis may not look as successful, but they have a real partner and everything just burns brighter for them.
All right, let's move this one too.
These people are the ones that act on their emotions, their positive emotions, and actually express these things, as opposed to just assuming the people around us are telepathic. Forgiveness is key to happiness. In any relationship, if you want it to be long-term, you have to bring forgiveness to the table. But the one piece of advice that seniors would give to their younger selves across almost every survey on happiness is not that they wish they'd made more money, not that they wish they'd had different partners. They wish they'd been less hard on themselves. And that is, they wish they'd been more forgiving of their own shortcomings. So forgiveness is not only a key component to successful relationships, it's key that you're forgiving of yourself.
Okay, there's two components to all this actually, and the first component is there's no such thing as happiness. So let's just throw that. I know I hate to piss in your Cheerios, I really do, but there's no such thing as happiness. There's no such thing as contentment. In fact, the human condition is defined by discontent, not by contentment. So whenever I hear somebody say, oh, there's this poll on happiness. Oh, there's this, what is it? Women are less happy than men. And I hear this quite a bit, even from manosphere, influencers, right? Well, these women have been taught that feminism, gave them all these superpowers and everything. And look, they're the most unhappy that there is. And then, of course, there's the counter argument to that, which is single and childless women are the happiest individuals on earth. It just depends on the message that's being sold at that particular time. So, putting all the conflicting messages to one side, then you've also got to consider the fact that happiness is something we sell women. We sell them on the belief that happiness is something that is maintainable for the rest of their lives. And this is, you want to know how to sell a product to women, tell them it's going to make them permanently happy. Tell them they are going to feel permanent contentment. Give them a product, give them a drug, give them a food, give them an experience, give them Taylor Swift, give them whoever, right? But the idea always comes back to the same thing. So whenever I see somebody say, well, the metric for happiness is X. Oh, okay, well, the problem with that is that happiness is something that is insubstantial. Happiness is actually an emotion. And so when we're talking about happiness and expressing happiness and all this other crap, we're still, again, approaching this from a female-centric, female-specific way of understanding particular emotions and which emotions are acceptable and which are not. If you ever wanted to know why, if you've ever seen the chart that I've shown on several occasions, why the prescriptions for antidepressants and SSRIs have shot through the roof for women, it's because of this one simple belief that you can in some way experience a permanent state of happiness. You'll never be unhappy if you take this drug, if you do these things, if you practice meditation, if you do Pilates, if you go to Lululemon, if you eat this, if you drink this, you'll be permanently happy. And the problem with that is that happiness is an emotion, and that emotion, those emotions are meant to move us from one state to another. Happiness is a proximate outcome, not an ultimate outcome, not a place that you get to. We can't be happy. We can only do the things that make us happy, the things that we feel happiness while we're doing those particular things. So when you're not doing those things, you feel unhappiness, or you feel like you're not getting anywhere, or you feel like you're stuck in neutral, right? The same can be said for sadness. The same thing can be said for anxiety. The same thing can be said for depression. Those are emotions, base emotions, that are meant to move you from one untenable state to a better, more tenable state. And usually it has to do with either survival or reproduction. Those are basically the two things that everything sort of distills down to when it comes to emotion. Are there more complex emotions? Sure, there are. Absolutely, there are. But they're based on the base emotions. So when we talk about happiness and somebody says, well, you're going to live a happier life if you do these things. Anyone who tells you that is selling you something. You're going to live a happier life if you communicate, if you are vulnerable, if you are emotionally available, if you have emotional intelligence. Anyone who tells you that they have a path to permanent, sustainable, nirvanic happiness is selling you an ideology or a product. So keep that in mind whenever you see somebody trying to, that's the first thing that I think of. Now, the other part of this is that there's nothing that has been more female centric than the idea of a sustainable happiness, because that's what women want. They want something that is like an eternal security. They want to know, they still want the thrill. They still want that roller coaster ride, but they want to know that there are adults behind the scenes that are making sure that everything that they get into is still going to be safe no matter what. So they want to feel the thrill of the car careening off of the freeway, and at the last minute, a parachute deploys, and she ends up safe and sound because someone behind the scenes was watching after her to take care of her. So it's sort of this idea of this amusement park that we have to build for women so that they can still feel excitement, but they also have 100% security. So when we're talking about contentment for women, it's got to be something that still is exciting, but it also has to be something that is 100% secure. And that's where a lot of this comes from. And that's where this female-centric thinking comes from. So when you talk to this guy who's talking about masculinity and gun violence, or you see this guy, that's an insecurity, right? If you look at Scott, 90% of what I see coming out of Scott Galloway right now is female language. It's emotionalist language. There's not a scrap of testosterone in this guy, at least as far as I've been able to tell at this moment. So when we're talking about vulnerability, when we're talking about happiness, when we're talking about all these things, remember, these are their emotional language. So when we're talking about being vulnerable, it's like, oh, it's okay to have a good cry, guy. It's okay to express your emotions if they're the approved ones. You're not supposed to express anger. You're not supposed to express frustration or depression or anything like that, especially not as a guy. And there's a reason for those, is because we don't think of those. We think that, I think on some level of consciousness, we understand that men don't process emotions the same way that women do. We don't cry at the end of Titanic. Not because we're stunted, but because we simply don't have the same hardware in our brains. Our synapses are not wired the same way that women's are. Men and women are different, and we experience the world differently, and we have different emotions through which we process that world. To say one is better than the other, or one is wrong and one is right, is where we're at right now. So I think when we look at these videos and we start talking, when we think, oh, bravo, I love what he's saying, blah, blah, blah. The reason, check yourself and say, why do I think that this guy's right? Why does this feel good to me? Why does this taste good to me? Well, because it's selling you on the idea of a permanent happiness. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this little quick hit video today. I'm going to be doing more of these in the future. If you haven't bought the book, please check out The Rational Male on Amazon.com. And you can find all 5 in the series. I actually have more than one. I'm also the co-host for Access Vegas. We do it live from Las Vegas here every Thursday at 8 p.m. Pacific, 11 p.m. Central. And then, of course, I do the Rational Male, my own podcast, on Sundays from 1 p.m. Pacific to 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. So until then, I'll see you guys for the next video. Thanks.